This is the Logitech PRO X2 SUPERSTRIKE, 2026's most hyped and controversial peripheral release so far, as according to Logitech, this mouse is the next step in PC peripherals, as its new Haptic Inductive Trigger System, HITS for short, removes the need for physical switches entirely, while simultaneously delivering industry-leading performance that supposedly reduces your click latency by up to 30 milliseconds, while also featuring rapid trigger and customizable haptic feedback. This mouse also features the same shaping as the GPX series, and on paper, the specs and performance of this mouse appear to be very impressive. However, as is often the case with Logitech's products, the marketing doesn't always reflect the mouse's actual use case, and that trend continues here, as the advertised performance of the SUPERSTRIKE doesn't remotely match its real-world performance, and the mouse is, in reality, quite underwhelming. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we'll be investigating all of Logitech's claims about their latest release here, and we'll talk in depth about the mouse's specs, features, performance, pros and cons, and whether the SUPERSTRIKE, despite my experience with it, is the future of PC peripherals, or if this is just a desperate Hail Mary from Logitech to hold on to what little relevancy they still have left in the peripheral market. But before we get started, a quick disclaimer: I purchased the SUPERSTRIKE with my own funds, and I was not flown out to their R&D office in Sweden to get an early look at the mouse, and as such, and as is the case for every product I review here on the channel, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you'll get my brutally honest opinions about the SUPERSTRIKE and every other product I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. And a quick thank you to all of our channel members for your ongoing support in making this review possible. If you enjoyed the video and want to support my work, consider becoming a channel member, as it is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a member gives you early access to all upcoming content here on the channel, including videos like this one. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I use this SUPERSTRIKE for about 2 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on both soft and hard pad types, though since I main hard pads, the mouse was tested on that pad type for the majority of the testing. For skates used, since the mouse's stock skates are more optimized, quote unquote, for hard pads than Logitech's prior designs, I did use them for a few days, but due to their unique performance, I opted to remove them in favor of using aftermarket skates for the remainder of my testing. And for firmware, the mouse was tested on version 42.0.11, the latest firmware version available at the time of this review. For versions, the SUPERSTRIKE is currently only available in the split black and white colorway, which Logitech oddly calls black despite the majority of the shell being white, but as we've seen with Logitech's previous releases, I assume in the future we'll see additional colorways for the SUPERSTRIKE release. For pricing, the mouse retails for an eye-watering $179.99 USD, which put the SUPERSTRIKE at the very top of the market in terms of pricing. And today I'll be reviewing the only colorway of the SUPERSTRIKE currently available, the black one. For packaging, the SUPERSTRIKE comes in the same style box we saw used for the GPX series, which has the same features listed on the back here, but funnily enough, they're listing G-Hub as a notable feature, which is ironic given how notoriously bad its usage experience is. And on the side of the box, more of the mouse's specs are listed, including the mouse's dimensions, weight, estimated battery life, and more. But one notable change here is that Logitech has added a small hand diagram to show what hand the mouse is optimized for. In addition to this, they've also added a QR code to the bottom here, which when scanned leads to a splash page of sorts for the SUPERSTRIKE, with links to the mouse's product page, support, setup information, and more. Opening the box by removing the top, we'll find the mouse itself, which is held in place by a cardboard insert. On the mouse's base, we'll find a large plastic sheet, which is installed to protect the mouse's interesting stock skates. On this protective film, there is also an advertisement for Logitech's PowerPlay system, which I'm less than enthused to see here. Thankfully though, this protective sheet can be removed easily, and it doesn't leave any adhesive residue behind when removed. And just as we saw in the GPX2, the base puck can be removed, revealing a small storage compartment for the mouse's USB-A dongle. You can also replace this stock puck with an optional skate puck, which helps to somewhat balance out the top and base skate surface areas, but we'll talk more about this later. On the topic of skates, Logitech claims they have made some improvements to the SUPERSTRIKE skates. As well, they are the same shaping as the GPX2 skates, Instead of being made of PTFE, these gates are made out of UHWMPE, a high durability material commonly used for hardpad optimized skates. This material change does make these new skates more durable, but this comes at the cost of significantly higher friction coefficients, which makes their performance a mixed bag to say the least, but we'll talk more about the skates and the skate puck in the skate segment towards the end of this video. Circling back to the packaging, removing this cardboard insert that held the mouse in place, in the bottom of the box we'll find the mouse's USB-A dongle, which comes pre-installed in a C to A adapter. This dongle and the adapter are the same types we saw used on the GPX2, which is disappointing to see. As well, this adapter has a slightly rubberized surface. Due to its lighter weight, it's very easy to displace. This is an aspect I expected Logitech to improve here on the SUPERSTRIKE, as a traditional dongle, like the ones used by almost every other brand, would have been a nice improvement compared to the current system, but for whatever reason, Logitech opted not to improve this aspect of the SUPERSTRIKE at all, a common theme we'll find throughout the design of this mouse. Above where we'll find the dongle, we'll find a small box, which contains the rest of the mouse's accessories. The first of which is a USB A to C cable, which looks very familiar, as this is the exact same cable type we saw included with the GPX2, having the same rubberized wrapping and non-tilted USB-C end. Seeing this type of cable again here is rather disappointing, as its rubber wrapping makes the cable very high friction, which makes the mouse's wired usage less than ideal to say the least. This is yet another aspect I expected Logitech to improve on coming from the GPX2, but again, they opted not to make any changes here, which is questionable to say the least, and we'll talk more about this stock cable and its performance later in this video. The next accessory we'll find in this box is a set of grip aids, which, just like the stock cable, are the same types we saw included with the GPX2, which is another disappointing aspect to see here, as these grips were a little underwhelming on the GPX2, and yet again, Logitech opted not to make any improvements to these grips, resulting in their performance being a little underwhelming, but we'll talk more about them later. I also wanted to note this small sheet of fabric that's placed on top of the grip aids is apparently a cleaning cloth according to the accessory list. Now, this isn't exactly what I refer to as a cloth per se, but it's nice to see included. Next, we'll find the optional skate puck we talked about a moment ago, and since we just talked about it, we'll skip over this one for now and talk about it more later. And moving on, next we'll find a paper insert which includes the mouse's regulatory, compliance, and warranty information, outlining the terms and conditions for the SUPERSTRIKE's 2-year warranty. But to Logitech's credit, one notable improvement they've made here is that they've included a recycling guide for the mouse, with these diagrams that show you how to disassemble the mouse and remove the battery so it can be recycled properly. There is even a dedicated support page for recycling the mouse, which is a great thing to see, and a big step in the right direction for Logitech compared to their previous releases. And hopefully in the future we'll see them offer more resources for recycling and repairing their products, but we'll have to see what they do in the future. And lastly, we have a setup guide, which gives a quick rundown of the mouse's features and how to set it up, and there's also a QR code that links to the SUPERSTRIKE support page, which is a nice attention to detail. As a preface to this segment, I purchased my SUPERSTRIKE directly from Logitech's website, so the build quality and QC of my unit should be reflective of a retail batch unit. Starting off with build quality, sadly, the SUPERSTRIKE is a mixed bag to say the least in this regard, as Logitech has changed many aspects of the mouse's build in an effort to counteract the weight added by the haptic system, while also keeping the weight roughly in line with the GPX series weight, which makes sense in theory, but in doing so they've introduced multiple issue areas here on the SUPERSTRIKE. Amongst these changes, the biggest and arguably most impactful is the top shell alterations, as it has been thinned out to be approximately 0.7mm thick, 0.4mm thinner than the GPX2's top shell, resulting in a weight reduction of approximately 1.30 grams. But in doing so, the thinner walling is much more prone to flexing and creaking, as on my unit shell, just below the side buttons, there is a significant degree of flex to this area, which is particularly noticeable when firmly gripping the mouse. This shell flexing has also caused another rather unique quirk on many SUPERSTRIKE units, where if you put pressure on the upper side shell, you can cause the main clicks to actuate if they're set to lower sensitivity levels, something I and many other SUPERSTRIKE owners have been able to replicate on their units, and shout out to AimAdapt who noticed this issue first and brought this to my attention. Admittedly though, at least on my unit, you do have to put a lot of pressure on the side shells for the clicks to actuate when set to more normal sensitivity ranges, but regardless, this is a rather concerning issue, and again, the side flexing on my unit is disappointing to see, especially given the mouse's price. But on the plus side, aside from the aforementioned issues, the rest of the shell on my SUPERSTRIKE is well built with no other issues from my testing. Looking inside the mouse, to Logitech's credit, the mouse is well built, having essentially the same internal design that we saw in the GPX series, just with the addition of the hit system and the haptics, but we'll talk more about them later. The mouse also uses the same ribbon cable connector that links all the top shell's components to the main PCB, and thankfully, not only is this cable easier to work with and wasn't kinked compared to the cable inside my GPX2, they're using a new ribbon cable connector on the main board, which is much easier to work with compared to the previous connectors. And to Logitech's credit, the redesigned main PCB is not only smaller and lighter than the main board on the GPX series mice, the soldering quality on all the mouse's PCBs is perfect for my inspections. Another unique attention to detail here is that just as they did in the GPX2, Logitech has glued the battery's JST connectors top down to secure the cables so they don't come loose over use. This is a nice attention to detail, but the glue can make disconnecting the battery's JST plug rather difficult in some cases, but we'll talk more about that later. For QC, this is where the SUPERSTRIKE becomes even more of a mixed bag, as the button implementations are questionable at best. Firstly, the main clicks are anchored into the top shell just as they were on the GPX2, but since the haptic motors are connected to the buttons themselves, which increases their weight significantly as each click weighs around 6.65 grams, Logitech has tried to counteract this weight by installing two tensioning springs toward the front of the shell here to control their rebound and bring them back to their natural position, but in doing so, these springs have made the buttons feel very heavy and spongy, and the lack of any additional stabilization to the buttons makes them very wobbly, which is especially noticeable if you click the buttons on their edges. The click implementations continue to get worse with the side buttons, as unlike these surprisingly well implemented side buttons we saw in the GPX2, the buttons here on the SUPERSTRIKE are oddly much heavier despite using the same switches and button designs, resulting in the side buttons here having a heavy spongy feel to them and uneven actuation weights, which is a very disappointing thing to see here. And things continue to get worse when we get to the scroll wheel here, as Logitech is still using the same wheel click and encoder they used on the GPX series, meaning that all the issues we've seen on the GPX series wheels are here on the SUPERSTRIKE, and to make matters even worse, the encoder on my unit is defective, but we'll talk more about this and the other click implementations later in this video. Circling back to the mouse's internal build, seeing as it uses essentially the same design as the GPX2, the mouse is more complex than many other mice on the market, which does impact its serviceability. And while some aspects of the mouse are still easier to service, due to some interesting screws inside the mouse, the SUPERSTRIKE is actually harder to service than the GPX series was, which is very disappointing to see, as I was hoping Logitech would improve their product serviceability coming from the GPX series, but Logitech seems to be doing the opposite. So in regards to both build quality and QC, the SUPERSTRIKE is beyond underwhelming in my opinion, and is a notable step back from the GPX series in many ways, and I understand batch 1 Logitech products often have a lot of issues, but the sheer amount of issues on my unit combined with the multiple questionable design decisions is unacceptable for a mouse of this price point, and what makes this subpar build quality and QC even worse here is that many of these changes were made to reduce the mouse's weight, but as we're going to talk about in a moment, that wasn't exactly successful either. For weight, as I just alluded to, instead of decreasing the mouse's weight, the SUPERSTRIKE, despite all of its internal changes, is actually heavier than the GPX2, but to be fair, it's only 1 gram heavier, being advertised as weighing 61 grams. But considering all the design changes inside the SUPERSTRIKE, I expected more of a weight reduction to be honest, even when considering the additional weight added by the haptics. But regardless of the mouse's design, just as we've seen Logitech do previously, there's no plus-minus gram ratio applied to the SUPERSTRIKE's weight here, but despite this, the industry standard of plus-minus grams still applies here, giving the mouse an estimated weight of 61 plus-minus 2 grams. Now for my unit's weight, the base weight of the mouse with no skates or grips or pucks installed is 58.49 grams, and weighing the stock skates, they collectively weigh around 1.31 grams, whereas the flat stock puck weighs around 1.20 grams, and the skate puck weighs around 1.66 grams, and the optional grip aids in their full-size configuration weigh 1.50 grams. Adding all these weights to the SUPERSTRIKE's base weight, the mouse with the full-size skates installed and no puck weighs 59.80 grams. In the mouse's stock configuration with the full-size skates and the flat skate puck, the mouse's weight is 61 grams on the dot, which is very impressive. Whereas with the full-size skates and the skate puck installed, the mouse's weight increases to 61.46 grams, and with the mouse's skates and the flat puck plus the full-size grips, the mouse's overall weight increases to 62.5 grams, and with the full-size skates plus the skate puck plus the full-size grips, the mouse's total weight is 62.96 grams. So just as seen on Logitech's previous products, the mouse is within its 61 plus minus 2 gram weight spec, but despite this, I still wish Logitech would advertise the industry standard plus minus 2 gram ratio, as without it listed, the mouse is technically outside its advertised spec in some specific configurations of course, but regardless, when adding on the industry standard of plus minus 2 grams, the mouse's weight is within spec. However, while the weight is only slightly heavier than the GPX2, given the amount of corners that have been cut to achieve this weight, these changes are, as we just talked about in the previous segment, fruitless in my opinion. As we've seen mice that weigh half the SUPERSTRIKE's weight have perfect build quality in QC, and seeing so many issues on a 61 gram mouse is very disappointing. But what makes the mouse's weight even more confusing is that Logitech has opted to keep the power play system here, which is a decision I'm frankly dumbfounded by. As instead of thinning out the top shell and adjusting other aspects of the mouse's design, they could have just removed the power play system entirely, as doing so would net them a reduction of around 2.46 to 2.92 grams, or even more when considering the dongle storage and the base shell here, and would have given Logitech enough wiggle room so to speak to keep the top shell's thickness and rigidity while also counteracting some of the added weight from the haptics. And removing the system also would allow Logitech to rework the mouse's atrocious skate design, as reducing the skate size by half, that would net them another 0.65 gram reduction, and the fact that Logitech's R&D team opted to sacrifice the mouse's build quality instead of removing the power play system speaks volumes to their stubbornness, and I hope they snap back to reality and remove this power play system from their premium products in the future, as it does more harm than good, especially here on the SUPERSTRIKE. But despite all the questionable design decisions here, the weight of the SUPERSTRIKE is usable, but it absolutely could have been better. But due to the mouse's design, there are many ways you can weight mod the mouse, and you can always remove the power play system yourself, and that will reduce the mouse's weight by around 2.5 to 3 grams in total. And if you want to learn more about how to remove this component and how to service the SUPERSTRIKE, get subscribed so you don't miss the SUPERSTRIKE's teardown video. And as a last weight related note, due to the stock skate's UHMWPE material, if used on fabric pads, the material's higher friction coefficients make the mouse feel even heavier than it already is, and as such, I would highly recommend removing the stock skates if you use a fabric pad, as PTFE or hardened PTFE material skates will feel much better than the stock ones will, and even if you use a glass pad, which is technically the skate material's optimal use case, the mouse's usage experience is better with aftermarket hard pad optimized skates. So in essentially every usage scenario, if you do decide to get a SUPERSTRIKE, make sure you get some good aftermarket skates to replace the stock ones for a better user experience, and we'll talk more about the mouse's compatibility with aftermarket skates later in this video. For axis balancing, the mouse's feel is similar to the balancing we saw in the GPX series mice, as the mouse is centrally balanced, but due to the addition of the hit system and its haptics, this added weight has forced Logitech to balance the mouse slightly more forward than what we saw in the GPX2, as the mouse is balanced at its 64.2mm points, slightly forward of the mouse's 62.5mm physical midline, whereas on the mouse's y-axis, due to the mouse's symmetrical shaping, it's perfectly balanced with no bias to the mouse's left or right sides. But while the mouse is well balanced, considering the internal changes as we see on most wireless mice, the rearly positioned battery acts as a counterweight to the mouse's forward region, and if this battery is modded out for a lighter or heavier one, the mouse's balancing will be affected. The same will happen if you opt to remove the power play system, so keep this in mind if you plan on modding the SUPERSTRIKE. It's also worth noting that compared to the GPX series mice, oddly, the SUPERSTRIKE feels more forward heavy, not because of the more forward balancing, but because of the mouse's stock skates, as as due to their high friction material and large size, they amplify the forward region's weight significantly, causing the mouse to feel very forward heavy during use, especially if you don't use the rear skate puck. But if you remove the stock skates and use aftermarket ones with lower friction materials, the odd forward heaviness goes away here on the SUPERSTRIKE, resulting in the mouse having a much more balanced feel in the hand. So again, I highly recommend removing the mouse's stock skates, as the usage experience with aftermarket ones is vastly superior to the usage experience with the stock ones. For shaping, despite the SUPERSTRIKE being in a new lineup, the mouse maintains the same shaping as the GPX series, which is a surprising decision from Logitech, as this is a jack of all trades but master of none approach to a mouse's shaping, something I myself and many others have criticized Logitech for in the past, and I assume that Logitech would have taken the opportunity here to tweak or adjust the shaping, seeing as the SUPERSTRIKE is the first of its kind, but just like many other aspects of this mouse, they opted to leave the shaping unchanged, which is a bit of a questionable decision in my opinion. But if you've been using a GPX series mouse and upgrade to the SUPERSTRIKE, one positive is you won't have to adapt to a new shaping, which is a positive for existing GPX users, I guess, but for everyone else this decision is still disappointing, as Logitech could have done several things to improve the shaping in my opinion. But regardless of the shape decisions, the SUPERSTRIKE, as I mentioned earlier, is right hand optimized, but due to its symmetrical nature, the mouse can be used ambidextrously, but left-handed users won't be able to utilize the side buttons due to their positioning. For the mouse's dimensions, for length, the mouse measures 125mm long. For width, at the forward region of the shell towards the top, the shell is approximately 61.5mm wide, while at its base, it's approximately 57.8mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at the thinnest part of the side shell's indentation, towards the top, the shell is approximately 59.4mm wide, and at its base, it's approximately 58.4mm wide. And at the mouse's rear region, at the widest part of the rounded rear hump, the shell measures approximately 63.5mm wide at its base. For heights, at the shell's forward region around the end region of the scroll wheel, the shell measures approximately 27.2mm tall. At the shell's mid region at the peak of the shell's hump, the shell measures approximately 40mm tall, and from the peak here, the shell tapers downward, terminating at a lip at the rear here, which measures approximately 5.4mm tall. For shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top down, we can see the aforementioned symmetrical shaping with the expected slight hourglass-like design, same as what we saw in the GPX2, that has a slightly widened top and base region, but unlike many other symmetrical mice we've seen before, the widths between the top and rear regions are quite similar. Even the mid region of the shell is wider than what we commonly see, resulting in the shell having fairly consistent width in all of its regions, just as we saw in the GPX2. Flipping the mouse over and looking from the base, we can better see the mouse's slight hourglass-like shaping, but interestingly, you can see that the sides of the mouse are relatively similar in their widths, as the base shell is what widens to match the upper shell's profile. This is unique as not too many mice do this, as they commonly rely on more inwardly tilted top shells to meld the two shells together. Looking from the sides, we can best see the top shell's profile, whose curvature has a more exaggerated rounded curvature than we commonly see on many symmetrical mice, and the hump of said curvature peaks right around the mouse's physical midline, while the rear region shell curvature is slightly more aggressively tilted than the forward region, which has a more flattened gradual curvature to it. It's also worth noting that both sides of the mouse's shell have unique ridges on their surface. However, this is more noticeable on the mouse's right side, as on the left side, the ridge is directly below the mouse's side buttons. Now admittedly, these aren't the most impactful when it comes to gripping the mouse, as they're not super pronounced, but the ridge on the right side does kind of create a ledge, so to speak, for your ring finger to rest against, and this is a unique feature, but again, these ridges don't really impact the mouse's usage or gripability, and you probably won't even notice they're there in most cases, and I was hoping Logitech would have made these a little more pronounced here, but again, they opted to keep the shaping unchanged from the GPX2. Turning the mouse and looking at it from its front, we can best see the mouse's forward shell curvature, which is more rounded than what we commonly see, which gives the main clicks a wider, more rounded curvature. From this perspective, we can also see the mouse's side shell profiles, which as mentioned earlier are ever so slightly inwardly tilted, but unlike many other symmetrical mice, the profile of the side shells here are largely flattened across the shell, with no real curvature to them, with the only exception to this being a slight increase in depth where the slight hourglass-like indentations are in the mid region, and the profile of the sides maintain their flatness all the way to the rear region, where they invert their shaping and become more inwardly tilted to match the rear shell's profile and curvature. And lastly, looking from the rear, we can best see the hump shaping, which unlike the forward region, has a more pronounced roundness and a much taller design, creating a taller, more pronounced rear hump shaping, grooving, exactly the same as what we saw in the GPX2. 4 contact areas for my 25.4 by 10.16 cm hands using an angled claw grip here on the SUPERSTRIKE. Starting off with palm contact, the raised rounded rear hump shaping creates a wider contact point for my mid-palm's mid to high region, while also creating contact points for my thenar's low region and my hypothenar's mid to low region, but due to the rear hump shaping, my grip's primary contact is the mid-palm region, whereas the hypothenar and thenar regions contact are secondary or more supporting. For finger contact, my thumb naturally rests towards the upper region of the mouse's left side shell, resting slightly above the forward side button, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward to rest it around the midpoint of the slight hourglass indentation in the mouse's left side if more control is needed. Whereas my index and middle fingers rest more towards the end region of the shell buttons, and due to the grooving in their surface, my fingers are somewhat guided by them towards the middle of the buttons, but due to the shallowness of said grooving, the guidance provided by them isn't as pronounced as it is on deeper grooving we'll find on other main buttons, meaning my fingers' position do shift a little bit during use, but for the most part they rest somewhere in the main click's end region around the middle part of the buttons. Next, my ring finger rests against the upper right side of the mouse's shell, being roughly opposite the positioning of my thumb when relaxed on the opposite side of the mouse. And lastly, my pinky finger rests towards the mid region of the right side shell, slightly below the deepest part of the mouse's hourglass-like indentation. But keep in mind I have very large hands and use a tilted grip style, so the way my hands work with the SUPERSTRIKE shell won't be the same for everyone, but you can use my contact regions and points as estimate for how the mouse's shell will feel in your hand. For hand size and grip style compatibility here for the SUPERSTRIKE, due to the mouse's symmetrical nature and very safe shaping, the mouse is, at least on paper, universally compatible with most hand sizes and grip styles. However, in reality, the mouse's size and weight can negatively impact some grip styles usage here, depending on a couple factors. But as a reminder, the mouse is right hand optimized, but due to its symmetrical shaping, it can be used ambidextrously, but again, left-handed users won't be able to use the side buttons due to their positioning. Now for hands measuring approximately 12.5 to 14.7 by 5 by 6.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring approximately 14.7 to 15.2 by 6.5 to 8 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips again. For hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 to 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 17.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips again. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips again. And for hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips. And for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips again. Now, technically speaking, you can use the SUPERSTRIKE with a fingertip grip just as you could in the other GPX series mice, but I wouldn't recommend doing so as the mouse is a little too big and too heavy for this grip style, and there are countless other mice in the market with scaled down, lighter, similar shapes that are much more optimized for fingertip usage. But keep in mind this is a rough estimate, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility here will vary from person to person. So if you're considering picking up the SUPERSTRIKE, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your middle finger to your proximal wrist crease, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckle, excluding your thumb, and you can use these measurements to estimate if your hand size and grip style compatibility is compatible with the SUPERSTRIKE or any of the other GPX series mice for that matter. For coating, the SUPERSTRIKE uses a coating that's reminiscent of the coating we saw them use on the GPX series, and while the coating does perform well, there are some unique quirks to it. Now to the touch, the coating feels reminiscent of the coating found on the GPX2, but here, instead of the coating's blend falling into the more chalky side of the spectrum, it feels a little more rubberized, specifically on the main clicks. This is because while the whole shell uses the same coating type, due to the color difference, there is a textural difference between the white and black parts of the shell, as the white parts are slightly more chalky, whereas the black sections are more rubberized. This is a unique quirk to the SUPERSTRIKE's coating, as I've never seen a mouse's coating vary in feel like this, but to Logitech's credit, the more rubberized feel on the main clicks does make the buttons very grippable, and they feel better texturally speaking compared to the more chalky segments of the coating. But regardless of its unique quirk, the coating did perform very well over my testing, providing ample gripability on the shell with both wet and dry hand types, and I found the coating to be slightly slightly more grippable than the GPX2's coating due to the slight increase in rubberiness, which is a good thing to see as this coating feels more in line with the coatings used by other brands' recent releases, giving the mouse a more modern, updated feel in regards to its coating. But while this coating does perform well, just like all great coatings, it does attract sweat, dirt, and oils from your hand like a magnet does metal, meaning the shell can become rather grimy looking, more so on the darker main clicks than the white sections of the shell. Thankfully, buildup doesn't really affect the coating's performance, but it can result in a grimy feel in some cases, but you can remove said buildup by cleaning the mouse's shell with a dry microfiber cloth, and I'd recommend cleaning the shell frequently, especially if you're picky about the mouse's appearance. Now normally, I'd say if you're picky about the aesthetics of your mouse, I'd recommend getting lighter colorways, but since there's just this split black and white coating for the SUPERSTRIKE currently, there's no way to avoid this grimy look as of now, but in the future if darker or lighter colorways for the SUPERSTRIKE are released, keep the coating's affinity for buildup in mind and stick to the lighter colorways if you're particular about your mouse's aesthetics. I also wanted to note, historically speaking, Logitech's mice with white coatings have had a lot of discoloration and yellowing issues, and so far I haven't seen any issues with the SUPERSTRIKE specifically, but the mouse just released, so we'll have to wait and see if Logitech has finally addressed this issue with their coating, and seeing as there does appear to be a difference between this coating and the GPX2's coating, I hope they did fix this issue, but we'll have to wait and see. For the included grip aids, disappointingly, the SUPERSTRIKE, as mentioned earlier, includes the same underwhelming grips we saw included with the GPX2 series mice, which come in a full-size pre-cut set consisting of click and side covers, but it doesn't include any universal side button or hump covers, something I expect to see included with a mouse released in 2026. But one positive aspect to these grips is they do have the same thinner form factor as the previous versions, which prevents them from having that noticeable lip or edge to them, and while the surface is decently grippy to the touch with dry hands, as the material has a bit of natural stickiness to it, when gripped with wet hands, the material becomes very slippery, much more so than the shell's coating does due to the lack of texturing on the grip's surface. But to be fair to Logitech, these grips are better, and I use that term loosely, than the grips included with other big brand mice, but compared to the grip aids included with WiseOwl or G-Will's products, they're quite underwhelming, and as such, while I'm glad to see grip aids included here, given the coating's fantastic performance, they're kind of pointless, and their typing isn't ideal either. And if you do feel the need to use grip aids here on the SUPERSTRIKE, you'll be much better off with aftermarket sets, as they'll offer superior performance and better shaping than these stock grips will. But while the current grips are a little underwhelming, hopefully on future Logitech products, we see some long overdue improvements to the included grip aids, as grip aids with a stickier material, modular form factor that includes universal side button and hump covers, like the grip aids we see included with G-Will's products, would be a great improvement here, as G-Will's stock grip aids are the golden standard in my opinion. For main clicks, the SUPERSTRIKE uses shell buttons that are essentially identical to the ones used on the GPX2, but as I mentioned earlier, the internals of these main clicks are very different, as instead of using traditional switches as they did in the GPX2, the mouse is using Logitech's revolutionary quote-unquote Haptic Inductive Trigger System, or HITS for short, which as I mentioned earlier, supports rapid trigger, customizable haptics, and according to Logitech, reduces click latency by up to 30 milliseconds, which is a very bold claim. This HIT system and the tech behind it is similar to the tech used in Hall effect keyboards, but unlike that system, the HIT system here is rather over-engineered and in reality delivers rather mediocre performance despite what Logitech claims. But before we dive into the tech of this HIT system, let's first talk about the shell buttons themselves. Now the buttons themselves, as I just mentioned, are essentially identical to the ones used on the GPX series, having the same rectangular adjacent shaping which widens toward their end region and have the thicker rounded tips to them. And due to the curvature of the shell's forward region, the buttons here are tilted, being the tallest towards the mouse's midline and shorter towards their edges, giving the buttons a slightly slanted curvature to them. And as mentioned earlier, the buttons share the same coating as the rest of the mouse's shell, which allows them to be quite grippable, but as I mentioned a moment ago, due to the color difference here, the coating on the main clicks is slightly more rubberized, whereas the rest of the shell feels a little more chalky to the touch. But despite the slight textural difference here, the main clicks are very grippy, arguably more so than the the rest of the shell due to their more rubberized nature. And just as we saw in the GPX2's main clicks, both buttons have a slight grooving in their surface, which runs from the button's end to mid region, and while this grooving is shallower than the groovings we've seen in other click implementations, it does slightly improve the button's gripability, as it somewhat guides your fingers to the middle of the buttons, and also helps to slightly counteract the button's more rounded, tilted nature, giving a semi-flattened area for your fingers to rest in. But since this grooving only runs to the button's end to mid region, if you click the buttons at their top region, there won't be any guidance there, so keep that in mind. Another feature that's carried over from the GPX series here is that both the main clicks are quite deeply indented into the top shell, which ensures that both buttons are free of any potential click interference issues, which is a great attention to detail. Now for click heights, since the SUPERSTRIKE is a symmetrical shape, both the main clicks share the same height, as at their end region the clicks are around 19mm tall, at their mid region they're around 28.3mm tall, and at their end region they're around 36.6mm tall. For audio feedback, despite the mouse lacking traditional switches, there is a slight degree of audio feedback from the clicks even with the haptics disabled, and here's how they sound without the haptics and with the haptics. Inside the shell on the daughter PCB here, instead of finding traditional switches like we would on the GPX series mice, here we'll find these unique looking zones etched into the PCB surface. These zones appear to be inductive sensors and generators, which when powered become magnetized, generating a tiny magnetic field above them. These zones interact with a metal bracket secured to the bottom of the main clicks that doubles as a support for their haptic motors. And when this bracket enters said magnetic field, depending on either their electromotive force, the EMF, or eddy currents, the change in the magnetic field will be detected, inputting an actuation at whatever sensitivity level the user configured. But just to be fully transparent, seeing as Logitech isn't giving much technical data on this HIT system, this is just my best estimate of how the system functions, as I disassembled the mouse and had to sort of reverse engineer it to try and determine how it worked. So keep in mind this system might operate differently from what I just outlined, but given that this tech is very similar to what we see inside of many AG boards, I think I'm right with my assumptions here. Now this HIT system is adjustable in 3 ways. Firstly, you can adjust the click's actuation point from 1 to 10, however Logitech isn't providing any measurement data for what these values mean, but given its similarity to HE tech, I assume the clicks have an actuation range of 0.1 to 2mm, but again this is just an estimate. Secondly, you can adjust the rapid trigger function from 1 to 5 or you can disable it, and this serves as a reset point where once the click travels quote unquote past the defined point, it can be reactuated again without needing to fully reset. Again, the same tech we'll find in many HE keyboard switches. And lastly, you can set the strength of the haptic feedback on the clicks between 1 or 5, or you can disable it entirely. Now this haptic feedback is unique to say the least, as it feels like an iPhone fingerprint reader just on a mouse, which I guess is a cool feature in concept, but in reality it feels quite jarring, as sometimes the haptics would pre-fire, whereas other times they wouldn't fire at all when I clicked. To be fair though, this issue seemed to be isolated to lower sensitivity levels with rapid trigger enabled, but it's something I wanted to mention regardless, and hopefully we'll see a firmware update released in the future to iron out the kinks with the mouse's haptic feedback. Now all these aforementioned features can be configured on a per click level, which allows a lot of freedom when customizing the HIT system, and I assume we'll see Logitech add more features to the SUPERSTRIKE in the future. Now before we talk about the performance offered by Logitech's HIT system, we need to circle back to the buttons and talk about their physicality, as they are one of, if not the worst feeling click implementations I've ever felt, as while the shaping of the buttons is good, because the haptic motors are installed in them, the buttons are extremely heavy, weighing 6.65 grams respectively. This results in the buttons having the heaviest click I've seen to date, feeling around a 90 gram force at their end to mid region and a 100 gram force plus at their top region, but due to the click's adjustable sensitivity, you won't ever experience this full actuation weight, but even still, the buttons are heavy, much heavier than the GPX2's main clicks and most traditional main click implementations implementations you'll find on other mice, as those click implementations have a lighter, snappier feel, whereas the SUPERSTRIKE's clicks feels very heavy and spongy. In addition to their odd weight, the main clicks have the worst stabilization I've ever seen, as they're anchored into the top shell just like we saw in the GPX2, but instead of having stabilizers in the top shell like we saw in the GPX2, the only stabilizers the clicks on the SUPERSTRIKE have is a small guidance rail for a spring and a very small clip toward the front of the buttons. This results in the buttons having an insane amount of play to them and a significant degree of wobble, which further worsens the already heavy, spongy feel of the buttons. And when it comes to travel, things continue to worsen here, as the buttons have a total travel range of around 3mm, and while you'll probably only use 1/3 of said travel range, the initial click feeling is still heavy and spongy. And when it comes to rebound, this is another area where the clicks struggle, as the button's rebound is controlled partly by the button's tensioning in the top shell and partly by a tiny spring installed below the front region of the buttons. Now this spring in theory should have improved the button's rebound, similar to what the springs did in the GPX2's main clicks, and I figured these springs would give the buttons here a similar snappy feel to the GPX2, but in reality the spring doesn't make the buttons very snappy at all, and is partially to blame for the button's high actuation weights, as you have to add additional pressure when clicking to counteract the spring's tensioning. All of these factors combine to give the SUPERSTRIKE's main clicks a, for lack of a better word, heavy flaccid feeling, which is far worse in comparison to not only the GPX2's main clicks, but also the majority of the peripheral market. And just for fun, I actually went through all of my mice to try and find a click as poorly implemented as the ones here, and the only mice that came remotely close was my SteelSeries Prime Plus, which released in 2021, and this Girl Gear mouse that released in 2007, and even then I preferred the feeling of those mice's main button implementations compared to the SUPERSTRIKE's. Now, Logitech obviously knew these buttons had a lot of issues, so they implemented haptics into them, which to be fair do a great job at masking the button's true feel, as whenever a click is detected, you get that iPhone-like physical feedback, which somewhat makes the buttons feel like you're clicking a physical switch, but even on its various strengths, the feeling doesn't match that of a real physical switch, and as I mentioned earlier, the haptics aren't perfect, as I ran into issues with them pre-firing or not firing at all in some cases, which I suspect is due to the poor rebound on the buttons, and another issue with these haptics is they significantly impact the mouse's runtimes, but we'll talk more about that later. So while the haptics are a neat feature here and offer a customizable click feel, in reality they're more of a masking effect to cover the abysmal button implementation here, and while you won't likely ever fully physically actuate the buttons, their heavy, flaccid, spongy click feel isn't fully masked by the haptics, specifically the button's actuation weights and rebound, resulting in the SUPERSTRIKE's main clicks feeling like a significant downgrade from the GPX2's and every other main click implementation on the market for that matter, despite its supposed performance. And while we're on the topic of main clicks, their anchoring is an area of concern for me, as normally the buttons are quite firmly anchored into the mouse's top shell via plastic standoffs, but here on the SUPERSTRIKE they're very loose, meaning that the tensioning of the buttons is essentially entirely controlled by these screws, and given how the main clicks on Logitech's previous mice had a habit of loosening over use, which to be fair does happen to every other click implementation on the market, but for some reason seems to be more frequent here on Logitech's products. Because of this loose anchoring is an issue area, as over long-term use and their tensioning starts to fail, the clicks could actually become loose, so much so where they fall into the magnetic field of the hit system, causing actuations when no pressure is being applied to the buttons. And just to test if his theory was correct, I actually slightly untensioned the main clicks on my SUPERSTRIKE to see if this was going to happen, and indeed the buttons started to false trigger with no pressure being applied to them with a slight untensioning of their screws. So this is definitely an area I have a lot of concerns about when it comes to long-term durability, and to make this aspect of the mouse even worse, the pilot holes for said anchoring screws are made of the same brittle plastic we saw in the GPX series, meaning that if your SUPERSTRIKE's clicks do loosen and you need to open the mouse to retension them, there is a high probability the pilot holes themselves will break, resulting in main clicks that cannot be properly tensioned, which is exactly what happened to my GPX2 after a couple months of use. Now that we talked all about the buttons and their implementation, moving on to the hit system and its performance, I will give credit where credit is due. The performance offered here is an improvement coming from Logitech's previous products, but this tech is not as groundbreaking as their marketing will have you believe, as while you can set the clicks to have essentially no pre-travel so to speak, the usability of the buttons in this mode is a mixed bag, as I found the clicks on the 1 to 3 actuation points to be extremely easy to misfire due to their sensitivity, and they feel similar to how it feels to play with an HE keyboard on its lowest possible sensitivity setting, as while it is faster, it's extremely difficult to utilize. Of course, you can grip the mouse in a way where your fingers hover over the main clicks to avoid this issue, but in doing so you'll add physical latency to your click, negating the up to 30 millisecond improvement supposedly offered by the hit system. But one positive to the click's hypersensitivity is that it does make the mouse excellent for spam clicking, drag clicking, or any other repeated actuation use case, which is where this hit system shines. However, outside of this niche use case, the system falls short in many ways compared to other click technologies. And this brings us to the advertised up to 30 millisecond click latency improvement Logitech says the SUPERSTRIKE supposedly offers. But in typical Logitech style, they're not providing any data to back up these claims, such as the testing methodology, what the hit system was configured to, what polling rate the latency was measured on, and what mice the SUPERSTRIKE were compared to. And conveniently, since there's no physical switches inside the mouse, traditional latency testing does not work here on the SUPERSTRIKE, meaning we're left in a unique situation where Logitech is advertising a bunch of performance improvements we can't verify with traditional methods. And I wanted to highlight the up to 30 millisecond improvement here, as that is a very important caveat to their latency values, and there's a reason why Logitech was so vague and didn't really provide any data to back up their claims, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now for my testing, since I can't do traditional latency testing here, I relied on VRT testing, which to be abundantly clear is not an accurate way of testing a mouse's latency, but a supposed 30 millisecond improvement should be impactful enough to be noticeable when measuring VRT. So over my testing period, every day I measured my VRT using the SUPERSTRIKE with the hit system set to 111 against the Razer DeathAdder V4 Pro, the G Pro Super Lite 2, and Game Gear OP1AK and the HTX Ultra, all measured on their max polling rates available on both connectivity types and with SPDT modes enabled on compatible mice, and taking all the data and filtering out any accidental pre-fires or overly late clicks and averaging out the roughly 2 weeks of data. When using the DeathAdder V4 Pro on its wireless connectivity, my average VRT was 215 milliseconds, whereas on wired connectivity it was 209 milliseconds. Moving on to the GPX2, on the wireless connectivity my VRT average was 221 milliseconds, whereas on the wired connectivity it was 210 milliseconds. Then on the HTX Ultra, on its wireless connectivity, my average VRT was 203 milliseconds, while on the wired connectivity it was 199 milliseconds. And on the OP1AK V2, on the wireless connectivity there was no values here since the mouse is a wired mouse, but on the wired connectivity my average VRT was the lowest out of all the mice I tested, being 182 milliseconds. And last but not least, the SUPERSTRIKE on its wireless connectivity, my average VRT was 209 milliseconds, and on its wired connectivity, my average VRT was 202 milliseconds. Now this data, aside from confirming I'm officially UNC, does show that despite Logitech's marketing, while there was a slight improvement in some cases, said improvement wasn't as pronounced as advertised and only netted an improvement of around 20 milliseconds in one specific case. But keep in mind, this type of testing just so happens to be the SUPERSTRIKE's strongest suit, as the clicks when set to their lowest actuation point have essentially no pre-travel, which makes them ideal for this type of testing. But as I mentioned earlier, these ultra-low actuation points were unusable for me as they were too sensitive to be used reliably, being similar again to the experience of using an HE keyboard on its lowest possible actuation point. So in reality, and on more usable actuation points for me being the 4 to 6 range, the benefits of the hit system performance start to fade, only netting a 5 to 10 millisecond VRT improvement compared to traditional switches, while also falling behind the VRTs measured use on mice with SPDT switches. And while VRT measurements is again not an accurate way of measuring latency, my usage experience backs up this data, as I didn't notice any significant jump in accuracy or any real world improvement using the SUPERSTRIKE when compared to mice using SPDT switches, even when it came to very click dependent use cases like playing Ash or Cassie in Overwatch. But to be fair to Logitech, when compared against traditional switch types there was a slight improvement here, but again it's nowhere near as pronounced as it should be given the supposed benefits of this hit system. So based on my testing and my findings, Logitech's hit system, while being slightly better than most traditional switch types in some specific use cases, falls short in every possible usage scenario when compared to SPDT switches. But where the SUPERSTRIKE really starts to lose ground when it comes to performance is the click implementation, as it severely hinders the SUPERSTRIKE's performance, as their poor stability and heavy spongy feel makes them astronomically worse than traditional switch implementations, even with the haptics enabled. And even looking at the hit system from an ergonomic point of view, any benefits of the system are again nullified by the click implementation here, and where compared to other mice I tested, while some of them were slower than the SUPERSTRIKE, their traditional click implementations were an overall better experience compared to the SUPERSTRIKE. Now before y'all get your pitchforks out, keep in mind that this is my opinion based off my experience. Other users with higher end hardware or faster natural VRTs will likely notice more of an improvement from the SUPERSTRIKE's hit system, but for me, while this tech is cool, the button implementation ruined the experience for me, which is really disappointing. And we'll have to wait and see what the SUPERSTRIKE's actual end-to-end latency is once people figure out how to properly test it, but even when that happens, I have a feeling the advantages of this hit system will be largely redundant when set to more usable actuation points, as mice with SPDT switches will almost certainly have better end-to-end latency, and if I had to guess, I would assume this hit system is going to bring Logitech kind of on par to an SPDT switch, but slightly worse. It will be better than most other switch types on the market, but again, it won't be as good as SPDT. But this is just theory crafting on my part, and we'll have to wait and see what the actual latency numbers end up being. But given my very lackluster experience I had with the hit system here, I really wonder what Logitech's reasoning was in designing it, as they could have just invested in developing a custom SPDT switch, and that would have given the SUPERSTRIKE superior performance and a significantly better click feel, as a click implementation similar to the GPX2's but with SPDT tech would have been fantastic and testable. But unlike many other aspects of this mouse where Logitech chose not to make any changes, here they opted to over-engineer a new click solution, which hasn't exactly worked out in their favor. And while I applaud Logitech for innovating and pushing new tech into the peripheral space, the current implementation is a little undercooked in my opinion, and hopefully in the future we'll see the system return, but in a more refined form after another year or two of R&D. And just as a final note here, I know I could have given the hit system more time to grow on me, but you have to consider the mouse's usage experience as a whole, as even if this system delivered top of the line latency that was better than every other mouse on the market, the myriad of other issues with the mouse, some of which we've already talked about, make this mouse very frustrating to use, and it's really annoying to see people tunnel vision on latency, as at the end of the day, shape is king, and the GPX shaping just isn't that great, and on top of that, almost every aspect of this mouse has some kind of issue with it, and because of this, I didn't put any additional testing time into the SUPERSTRIKE here, as again, even if this had industry-leading click latency, it's not a mouse I'd use given the multitude of issues with it. Moving on to the side clicks, the SUPERSTRIKE uses the same side button design we saw used on the GPX series mice, having the same slightly curved pill-like shaping with a slightly rounded surface, which are ever so slightly forward angled to match the curvature of the top shell. The side button's positioning is also the same as it was in the GPX mice, being positioned slightly forward of the mouse's 62.5mm physical midline, but slightly behind the mouse's forward sensor position, being centered around the mouse's 66.3mm mark. But unlike the side buttons on the GPX X2, which inexplicably appear to have a different coating compared to the rest of the shell, here on the SUPERSTRIKE, the side buttons share the same coating as the rest of the shell, which improves their usage experience compared to that on the GPX2. And for anchoring, just like the other GPX series mice, the side buttons here are anchored into the mouse's central cage structure, not the top shell like we commonly see, but oddly, the side buttons have the same thin angled gapping between them, which is something I expected to see Logitech address here, as on the GPX2, the side buttons were easy to misactuate if clicked on their inner edges, and the same goes for the buttons here, which is rather disappointing to see. But while I'm not a fan of the thinner gapping between the buttons, despite my usual aversion to buttons with rounded surfaces, since the side buttons here are only slightly rounded, they feel more flattened than other similarly designed side buttons, and since they are decently pronounced in the mouse's side shell, the buttons are quite easy to actuate, and I am glad Logitech kept this side button style from the GPX series, as they're shaped quite well in my opinion. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the SUPERSTRIKE side buttons. Inside the mouse, and just as we saw in the GPX2, here we'll find two mel0n D2LS21 micro switches, which are mounted onto the same peg-mounted PCB. Admittedly, this PCB type is disappointing to see again, as it's not very user serviceable, seeing as it's integrated into the ribbon cable that connects all the top shell's components to the main board, but seeing as this is the same integrated PCB design that's being adopted by pretty much everyone on the market right now, this isn't a downside per se, but I do wish it was more user serviceable. Now these D2LS LS21 switches have a cycle rating of around 5 million and are rated for an actuation weight of around 61 grams according to mel0n's spec sheet, but oddly the switches here are much heavier and the actuation weight of the buttons differ, as the forward side button is more akin to an 80-85 gram force weight, whereas the rear button feels more akin to a 70 to 80 gram force weight. This is yet another very odd quirk to the SUPERSTRIKE, as I've never seen a mouse have differing actuation weights on their side buttons until now, and this does slightly affect the side button's usage usage experience, as it will take some time to get accustomed to their differing weights, but after a couple days of use the clicks start to feel a little more normal. For stabilization, both the buttons are rather well stabilized with only a slight degree of play to them when actuated, and for travel, both the buttons share similar degrees, both having a low degree of both pre and post travel, but it's worth noting the forward button, due to its heavier actuation weight, has an ever so slightly longer travel range, but not to a degree that will significantly impact their usage. And when it comes to rebound, oddly, both buttons have a very spongy feel to them, specifically the forward button, as the rebound strength on them is surprisingly weak compared to the GPX2 side buttons, which had a much snappier rebound to them. This is quite disappointing to see, as I actually quite like the feel of the GPX2 side buttons, and seeing yet another switch on this mouse have a spongy feel to it is quite disappointing, and hopefully the feel of these side buttons is improved and evened out on future batches of the SUPERSTRIKE. For scroll wheel, this is yet another area where Logitech has continued to make some questionable design decisions, specifically with the components used here, as given the issues we saw in the GPX2 series mice, I assumed improvements would have been made here, but given the myriad of other questionable design decisions on this mouse, Logitech, unsurprisingly, opted to keep the implementation the same as it was in their other mice, meaning that all of the aforementioned issues we've seen on their previous releases have carried over here to the SUPERSTRIKE. Now starting with the wheel itself, as expected, it is the same type found in the GPX2, being a plastic wheel with a slightly rounded rubber texturing wrapped around it that has a linear texturing etched into its surface. The wheel also shares the pronouncements found on the GPX2 scroll wheel, which is a nice touch and makes the wheel easy to utilize and gives it a full scroll range of 10 steps. Inside the mouse, we'll find the first questionable design decision here, as here we'll find another TTC silver dustproof 24-step encoder, the same type of encoder that was used on the GPX2, just a slightly taller 9mm variant. This type of encoder has been a common issue area for many users on not only the GPX series but many other mice, as this encoder is rather prone to issues over long-term use. And funnily enough, while the encoder on my GPX2 was surprisingly well implemented, the encoder here on my SUPERSTRIKE has a weird ratcheted grinding sound when scrolling, and has a heavier scroll force and scroll points compared to my GPX2 scroll wheel. And just so I can show you how bad this sounds, here's how the SUPERSTRIKE's wheel sounds compared to the GPX2 scroll wheel. Now, while the wheel here on the SUPERSTRIKE is usable, this encoder is sadly living up to its reputation, which is disappointing to see, and given all the issues that have plagued this encoder on their previous releases, I'm frankly shocked Logitech didn't improve the encoder here on their top-of-the-line product, as competitors' brands have adopted optical or more durable encoder types on their products to great success. Now, because of the likely defective encoder here on my SUPERSTRIKE, I'm going to be using the GPX2 scroll wheel for this segment, as that scroll wheel is a good representation of how it's supposed to feel here on the SUPERSTRIKE. Now, normally this encoder will have a light to medium scroll force with semi-pronounced scroll points, which gives the wheel a lighter overall feeling, which I'd say is a little too loose personally speaking, as it's very easy to accidentally input scrolls when trying to wheel click, which while not being a massive issue per se, is yet another reason why Logitech should have swapped this encoder out for a stronger, more durable one. Another notable change here is that the wheel on the SUPERSTRIKE is anchored more traditionally, resting in these plastic standoffs that protrude from the top shell, and gone is the spring retention mechanism we saw on the GPX2's wheel, which initially I thought would be a good thing, but when I played around with the wheel more, I noticed that the scroll wheel here was much looser than the GPX2's, to the point where I can actually pull the wheel up and out of the shell quite a bit, whereas on the GPX2, that retention mechanism keeps it in place. So this is yet another area where an important aspect of the mouse has been removed due to the added weight from the hit system, and while this won't likely impact the day-to-day usage, long term I have concerns about the wheel's durability, as this looser implementation here will put more strain on the already questionable encoder typing here. Moving on to the wheel click, this is yet another area where Logitech's implementations continue to struggle, as the SUPERSTRIKE is using the same boxy pillar switch we saw inside the GPX2, which is yet another component that's been very prone to issues in the past, and those issues continue here. The biggest issue with this switch is due to its pillar nature. The force required to input an actuation can be rather inconsistent, as if the switch is bottomed out and then ever so slightly slightly untensioned, the switch will stop inputting and require a full reactuation to function again. Now, while this isn't exactly an issue area many will run into here, for those of you who use the wheel click for in-game action, scrolling web pages, or other usage, you'll probably experience issues with this switch, and this downside is yet another reason why pillar switches frankly suck, but also why this component specifically should have been swapped out here on the SUPERSTRIKE. But to be clear, I wouldn't call this quirk to this switch a defect per se, as this happens on a lot of pillar switch types, but it is something worth mentioning here. Now, the wheel click switch has an actuation weight similar to that of the rear side button, feeling around the 75 to 80 gram force range, and has a low degree of both pre and post travel, but due to its pillar switch nature, the switch's rebound is very spongy, which, I hate to say this, fits in perfectly with the rest of the SUPERSTRIKE's buttons, but definitely gives the scroll wheel click a subpar feel compared to mice that use full-size switches for their wheel clicks. And as a last note here, the mouse also has the same B-hop mode that we saw in the GPX series mice, which you can enable to add a debounce filter of sorts to the encoder to help filter out accidental inputs. Now, the name would make you think this is some kind of B-hop related feature, which to be fair, it does work for that use case, but as I talked about in the GPX2's review, this feature is more of a software patch for the issues with the scroll wheel's durability, and while there is some merit to this feature, again, this feature is really only here because Logitech cheaped out on the scroll wheel's encoder, and if they used an optical or more durable encoder type, this feature wouldn't be required per se, but at least you can use it to get a little more life out of the scroll wheel's encoder if it starts to fail in the future. Moving on to the SUPERSTRIKE sensor and MCU, as we've seen with many other aspects of this mouse, this is yet another area where Logitech has continued to make some very questionable decisions. Starting off with the sensor, the SUPERSTRIKE is using Logitech's Hero 2 sensor, the same V4 revision we saw used in the GPX2, which released almost 3 years ago, which is an interesting decision, as I expected Logitech to update the sensor given that this is their top of the line product, but for whatever reason, they stuck with the Hero 2, which means many of the issues people have experienced with the sensor on the GPX2 have also carried over to the SUPERSTRIKE here, which is frustrating to say the least. But before we talk about the sensor spec and performance, let's talk about its positioning. Now, the sensor is centrally positioned in the mouse's shell as it's positioned slightly forward of the mouse's 62.5mm physical midline, positioned roughly at the 67.85mm mark, just as we saw in the GPX2. This slightly forward position can result in the mouse feeling a little odd at first if you're new to the GPX shaping, as it is slightly disjointed from the mouse's balancing range, but after a couple days of use you should acclimate to the sensor's position and the mouse's balancing without issue. Now, for sensor specs, the Hero 2 V4 revision has a DPI range of 100 to 44,000, which can be split on its X and Y axis, which is adjustable by 10 DPI steps below 2000 and 100 DPI steps above 2000. The sensor also has an IPS rating of 888 and a max acceleration of 88 grams, but the sensor's LOD levels are just listed as low, medium, and high, with no given values to these levels. But I assume these values correspond to a 0.71 and 2mm LOD. Another noteworthy aspect to this sensor is that unlike PixArt sensors, the Hero 2 doesn't support motion sync, ripple, angle snapping, and is advertised as having no smoothing or acceleration built into it. This also means that the sensor doesn't support sensor tilting, a very underrated feature that can drastically improve your ergonomics and performance, but thankfully you can use raw Excel to tilt the SUPERSTRIKE sensor, as I did over my testing, and if you want to learn more about sensor tilting and what it does and why you should be using it, you can check out my full guide to sensor tilting, which will be linked on screen here and down in the video description. Now, from a consumer standpoint, the Hero 2 appears to be a superior sensor compared to PixArt's offerings, as it has a higher DPI acceleration and IPS rating, but as we've seen many times, these numbers are largely marketing fluff, and the difference between the Hero 2 and PixArt sensors has gotten sizable since Logitech hasn't updated their sensor in 3 years, as PixArt sensors not only have more customization, support a wider DPI and step range, support ripple, angle snapping, motion sync, and native sensor tilting, amongst some other features, all of which are features that should be supported on Logitech's Hero sensor. So yet again, Logitech has left another component as is on their previous releases, meaning the sensor performance here on the SUPERSTRIKE is identical to the GPX2, which came out 3 years ago. And due to the age here, I would classify the Hero 2 as a very outdated sensor compared to the sensors used by by other brands, but my biggest gripe here with the Hero 2 is that the long-standing sensor spinout issue is still an issue here despite Logitech saying it was fixed, as the sensor will just randomly spin out just as it did in the GPX2. And over my testing here on the SUPERSTRIKE, I had 4 instances of the sensor spinning out on both glass and fabric pads, something I've never experienced on a PixArt sensor to date. And to be completely honest, this issue still being present on a Logitech sensor is completely unacceptable for a mouse released in 2026, as this has been an issue on the Hero 2 V4 for 3 years now. And if the outdated sensor wasn't bad enough, unlike the rest of the peripheral market which has adopted the Nordic 54 series MCUs, Logitech is still using a Nordic 52 series SoC here, specifically the NRF 52833. This is very disappointing to see, as again this component should have been upgraded along with most of the mouse's other components, as the new 54 series Nordic MCUs are not only more power efficient, they offer slightly improved latency and performance, and some SKUs even natively support dual AK polling, but on the SUPERSTRIKE specifically, the power optimizations are a real issue here with that outdated MCU that could have been addressed with a new 54 series MCU, but we'll talk more about this in a moment. So yet again, and I feel like I've said this 50 times in this review already, as we've seen way too many times here, instead of improving the components inside the mouse, Logitech opted to use the exact same sensor and MCU configuration they used 3 years ago in the GPX2, which is really disappointing to see, and more so here on the SUPERSTRIKE, as again this outdated MCU does not fare very well with the haptics, and the runtimes in the mouse are very subpar because of this. And if they were to upgrade at least the MCU, this would help address this issue, but again they just decided to use the same hardware they used 3 years ago, which is really disappointing to see. For connectivity types, just as we saw in the GPX2, the SUPERSTRIKE only supports 2 connectivity modes, one being wired USB-C and the other being 2.4 GHz wireless. But in a very questionable decision here, despite this being Logitech's top-of-the-line product, they haven't updated the connectivity types or port rates here, as on the wireless connectivity, the mouse supports the expected range of 125 to 8000 Hz, but on wired USB-C, the mouse still only supports 125 to 1000 Hz. This limitation is due to the MCU choice here, as instead of adopting a 54 series SoC that natively supported dual AK, like the NRF 54H20, or even the more power-efficient NRF 54L15, though that MCU does need an additional controller to allow for dual AK, something they technically could have done here on the existing MCU as well, but again, as we just talked about, they didn't do anything to the MCU here on the SUPERSTRIKE. Now, I'm sure people are going to complain I'm being nitpicky here, but seeing as most, if not all, of Logitech's competitors have adopted not only update MCUs but also dual AK polling, this limitation is incredibly disappointing to see on a mouse that's supposedly the best on the market and is priced as one too, and this limitation is, in my opinion, unacceptable for a mouse released in 2026 or even 2025 for that matter. Another interesting design decision here is that Logitech has opted to keep the same integrated antenna design instead of adopting a dedicated antenna design we've seen many other brands use on their newer releases. Now, to be fair, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but dedicated antennas do offer superior range, transmission stability, and improved anti-interference tech compared to these integrated antennas, and like many of the other components here on the SUPERSTRIKE, I had hoped Logitech would improve this aspect as well, but seeing as they haven't improved the majority of the mouse's specs, I'm not exactly surprised at this point. But to Logitech's credit, despite the older hardware here, and as we've seen on their previous mice, all of the mouse's respective polling rates on both its connectivity types were very well implemented, but again, the lack of dual AK polling is very disappointing to see here, as that would have brought the SUPERSTRIKE's connectivity in line with the rest of the market, but it looks like we'll be waiting a bit longer for Logitech to catch up in this regard. For battery, inside the SUPERSTRIKE, we'll find a smaller size 290 mAh battery, the same type of battery we saw used in the GPX2, which unlike that mouse is actually clamped into place now, as Logitech has added a small little clamp on top of the battery, which is a nice little attention to detail. This battery, since it's the same one that was used in the GPX2, also uses the same 2mm JST connector, which due to its size and the connector's position on this new PCB, just as it was in the GPX2, is rather difficult to disconnect, as the amount of of force needed to disconnect this plug is so high you can actually bend or snap this protruding part of the PCB very easily, so if you plan on modding the SUPERSTRIKE's battery, keep this in mind. Now, oddly, Logitech is advertising that the mouse's runtime will be 90 hours measured on constant motion apparently, which is 5 hours less than the estimated runtime of the GPX2. And they also don't specify what report rate this was measured on or what the mouse's haptics were set to, but things get weirder when you look at the official Logitech Amazon store page for the SUPERSTRIKE, as there, the battery life is estimated to be 60 to 90 hours, but there's no mention of this on Logitech's official product page. So just as we saw in the GPX2, we have rather ambiguous runtime data to work with here, but regardless, measuring my mouse's runtimes with the gaming surface set to off and the sensor set to its max DPI of 44,000 and running on a firmware version 42.0.11. On 1 GHz with rapid trigger disabled, the mouse's runtime was around 123.7 hours. On 1 GHz again, but with rapid trigger enabled, the mouse's runtime dropped down to 110.5 hours. On 2 GHz with rapid trigger disabled, the mouse's runtime was around 87.31 hours, and on 4 GHz with rapid trigger disabled, the mouse's runtime was around 60.75 hours, and lastly on 8 GHz with rapid trigger disabled as well, the mouse's runtime was around 32.9 hours. Now while these runtimes are better quote unquote than the ones we saw in the GPX2, keep in mind that rapid trigger will impact the runtimes as we saw with the 1 GHz test, and the click's haptics will significantly reduce these runtimes, as with rapid trigger enabled and the haptics set to their maximum strength, they reduce the mouse's runtime by up to 40%, which as you can see here significantly reduces the mouse's runtimes. Now obviously many of you probably won't be using the haptics on their strongest setting, but regardless an up to 40% decrease in runtime is insane to see and makes that odd 60 to 90 hour estimate we saw on the Amazon page make a lot more sense. Now technically you can use the mouse without the haptics, but again the poor click implementation kind of forces you to use them, meaning you're forced to sacrifice the mouse's runtime for a better click feel, which is yet another significant downside to this hit system. Now considering the impact the haptics have on the mouse's runtime, again I'm so confused as to why Logitech didn't use a Nordic 54 series MCU, as the new MCUs are significantly more power efficient as we've seen on many other mice, as they offer vastly superior runtimes compared to the 52 series MCUs. And if Logitech had updated the MCU here on the SUPERSTRIKE, the effects of the haptics would still obviously reduces the runtimes, but the base runtimes would be way longer, giving the SUPERSTRIKE a much better overall runtime across the board compared to what we see here. And lastly for charging, the mouse charges via the front-facing USB-C port, which is recessed into the shell just as the port in the GPX2 was, which can impact the mouse's compatibility with some aftermarket cables, but most cable types should be compatible here as long as they have a thinner USB-C end, and given the lackluster usage experience with the stock cable, you'll want to use an aftermarket cable here on the SUPERSTRIKE, but we'll talk more about that later. And just like the GPX2, the battery here on the SUPERSTRIKE is moddable, though of course it's being held in by this clamp at the top, but also a very large adhesive pad underneath it, which does make removing the battery rather difficult, but it is moddable. However, keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, the battery is the counterweight for the mouse's forward region, so if the battery's weight or size is changed, it will affect the mouse's balancing, so keep this in mind if you plan on battery modding your SUPERSTRIKE. For software, just like all of Logitech's products, the mouse's functions are controlled by G-Hub, which as I talked about when I reviewed the GPX2 is a less than ideal user experience, as G-Hub is arguably the most overcomplicated software available on the market. So instead of going over all the features and the usage experience of G-Hub again, I'm actually going to talk about an alternative here, as Logitech has another management program called Onboard Memory Manager, which offers a more lightweight way of managing the SUPERSTRIKE and all of their other products, and I'll have the download link for this program linked down in the video description. Now to utilize this software, you will need to download G-Hub to toggle the mouse to its onboard memory mode, and unfortunately all the firmware updates are done via G-Hub, so you can't do them via Memory Manager, but while you still have to use G-Hub for some aspects here, the majority of the day-to-day management can be done via Memory Manager. Opening the program, you'll be greeted by a single page layout, which at the top there's a drop-down menu to select the device you want to manage, and next to that there's also a profile selector, which you can use to toggle the mouse's 5 onboard profiles. Below that there is a readout of the mouse's charging level and connectivity type, a button to reset the mouse to its factory settings, and an advanced box which you'll want to check to unlock some additional settings here. Next we have the DPI settings, in which you can select the number of slots you want to use between 1 and 5, and you can select the DPI values you want to use on the mouse's X and Y axis, which is a great attention to detail. And to the side of this section there are more options to the mouse's LOD levels, and you can set it to low, medium, and high. On the topic of LOD, if the mouse's gaming surface mode is enabled or set to auto, you might not be able to change these LOD values here, and to adjust them you'll have to go into G-Hub and disable the mouse's gaming surface mode, and then you can adjust the values here. Next we have a small section for the mouse's button assignments, in which you can adjust the binds on the mouse as well as set the G-Shift keybinds too, but just like we saw in Logitech's previous mice, the rebind options are rather limited, but at least there's options for swapping the mouse's profiles, which is nice to see. Next to the button tab we can configure the mouse's polling rates, which as we talked about earlier, on the wireless connectivity the polling rate range is 125 to 8000 Hz, whereas on wired connectivity the polling rate is capped to 125 to 1000 Hz. Below that we have a small section for the scroll wheel's B-hop mode we talked about earlier, and as I said when I reviewed the GPX2, this is implemented more so as a filter to prevent issues with the scroll wheel over time more than an actual function, but regardless this is a nice feature to see here. And below that we have the hit system configuration section, in which you can configure the button's actuation point from 1 to 10, enable or disable rapid trigger, and set its sensitivity from 1 to 5, and you can also adjust the button's haptics, which can be set from 1 to 5 or disabled. And as I mentioned earlier, all these settings can be toggled on a per click level, so if you want your left click to be more sensitive or have a stronger haptic feedback than the opposite button, you can configure that all here. Now to save any settings inside this memory manager, you'll need to click this save button at the top of the window, as the driver will not autosave like G-Hub does, so keep that in mind. But that's a quick rundown of the usage experience here for Logitech's memory manager, which is in my opinion light years better than G-Hub, but if you do want to learn about G-Hub's usage you can check out the software section of a GPX2 review as I cover it there. Just keep in mind the options will vary slightly due to the hit system here. But while Memory Manager makes configuring the SUPERSTRIKE settings much easier than before, I'm surprised Logitech hasn't implemented a WebDriver yet, as almost every other brand has done so on their products, even Razer now, and if they were to take the more simplistic usage experience of the Memory Manager and make it a WebDriver, that'd be a fantastic offering, and hopefully we'll see Logitech release a WebDriver for their products in the future. For repairability, the SUPERSTRIKE is unsurprisingly a mixed bag, just as Logitech's previous mice have been, but due to some internal changes, the SUPERSTRIKE is actually harder to service than the GPX series was, which is very frustrating to see. The reason for the worsened serviceability here is that Logitech has appeared to replace the majority of the screws inside the mouse with what appear to be stainless steel or some other non-magnetic metal screws. And if you've taken apart a Logitech mouse, you know how hard it is and how many screws there are, and the screws inside the SUPERSTRIKE being non-magnetic makes this disassembly process even harder than it already is. But aside from the interesting screws here, the disassembly process is essentially one-to-one to the process used for the GPX2, with some slight changes due to the hit system of course, which makes the mouse serviceable to an extent, but when working on the main clicks you need to be extremely careful with them, as the hit system is very sensitive to the buttons tensioning, and I had a weird instance where after my second disassembly of the unit, the clicks just stopped functioning entirely, but the next morning when I turned the mouse on they functioned totally fine, so there seems to be some kind of auto calibration or something with this hit system that can be a little finicky in some cases, so be very careful if you do open up the SUPERSTRIKE to service it, as they're rather sensitive to their tensioning. But despite this, if you do want to learn more about servicing a SUPERSTRIKE and how to repair its various components, learn more about its modding options, or just want to see how the mouse is designed on the inside, get subscribed so you don't miss the SUPERSTRIKE teardown video, which will be releasing very soon. For stock skates, historically speaking, Logitech skates have been some of, if not the worst you'll find on the market, and in an effort to fix this, Logitech has used a new skate typing here on the SUPERSTRIKE, and while I'm happy to see this to an extent, and I do give them credit for trying to improve them, they somehow made the stock skates worse in almost every possible way. Now, historically speaking, Logitech has used these thinner PTFE skates, which historically have had very poor durability on their products, but here they've opted to use a rather unique material blend called Ultra High Molecular Weight Polyphylline, or UHMWPE for short, which some of you might recognize as this material is commonly used in hardpad optimized skates. But oddly, on the mouse's product page and box, there's no mention of the skates or their material, but on the Amazon page it lists them as being UHWMPE, which I thought was kind of odd, as you'd think Logitech would highlight the change given their skates history. Now, while this UHMWPE material is more durable than PTFE by a significant margin, the downside to it is its friction coefficient, as it has a significantly higher friction friction feel than PTFE does. To such an extent, many brands who've released skates using this material tell you not to use them on fabric pads because of this. But to make things even more confusing here, on the official Amazon product page for the SUPERSTRIKE, Logitech says these extra large gliding UHMWP skates are made for effortless movement, which is hilarious as in reality these are without a doubt the slowest, muddiest, and most unusable stock skates I've ever seen ship with a mouse, as on fabric, specifically control focused ones, these skates are frankly unusable, as their initial dynamic and braking frictions are so high they make the SUPERSTRIKE feel like you're moving it through mud. The same goes for hybrid pads, as they're still unusually controlled in most cases, but depending on the surface weave or material type on this pad type, you might be able to use them, whereas on speed pads the usage experience was palatable, which is the nicest way of saying they weren't complete garbage, but again the skate's sticky and muddy nature worked against their performance here as well. But when it comes to hard pad usage, the usage experience was definitely better, at least initially, which shouldn't really be a surprise as this material is made for hard pad use, and as such the stock skates felt pretty good at least initially on all the hard pad types I tested, but the performance quickly faded here as well, as not only is the skate's durability weirdly subpar compared to other UHMWPE material skates, the shaping of the skates and their unbalanced surface areas made the skates feel very awkward once they were worked in, which makes the mouse feel heavier than it actually is in essentially every use case, even their quote-unquote optimized one. And again, I would highly recommend using lower friction aftermarket skates here, as they not only perform better, they'll help produce the mouse's heavier feel. So just like Logitech's older style of skates, despite the new material here, these skates are extremely underwhelming even when used on their optimized use case, as they're astronomically worse than their prior skates in essentially every way, which is very confusing to me. And the only edge, and I use that term loosely, these skates have over Logitech's prior ones is their supposed durability, but again, given their odd wear rate I experienced on hard pads, I have my doubts about that aspect of these skates as well. But one positive to these stock skates is that Logitech has added a thin foam layer between the skates and their base adhesive, which is harder than the SMPF or Poron or Slim Flex layers we've seen used on other brand skates, which does allow the stock skates to have a lower than expected degree of audio feedback when used on hard pads, which is an attention to detail I frankly didn't expect to see here. And just like we saw on the GPX, there are skate removal ramps in the mouse's base, and the new skates adhesive actually is quite good, meaning they're actually very easy to remove, and the skates don't leave any residue behind, which is a nice improvement from their older skates. But again, the skates themselves are questionable to say the least, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I would have rather seen Logitech use their traditional PTFE skates here instead of these UHMWPE ones. But while the skates are interesting, one notable improvement here is that Logitech has finally thinned out the skate channels on the mouse's base, which is especially noticeable when comparing them to the channels on the GPX2. This change makes the mouse's compatibility with aftermarket skates superior to their other mice, but I've said several times in this video already, the shaping of the channels is atrocious, specifically the base area, as this thin U-shaped channel is only compatible with 6.5mm dot skates, whereas the top channel is compatible with all types of aftermarket skates. In addition to this, the surface area between the top and bottom skates is horribly balanced, even with the optional skate puck, and the larger top skate in combination with the skate's more controlled material not only makes the mouse feel very heavy as I mentioned earlier, it also makes the mouse feel weirdly forward heavy. And due to the lackluster performance of the stock skates and the improved aftermarket compatibility here, over my testing I used the X-Ray Pad Jade Air, Obsidian Air, and U9 series dots. I used a 4-4 configuration to balance out the surface area on the base here, and those dots significantly improve the overall usage experience of the mouse. So just as I said when I reviewed the GPX2, the forced compatibility with Logitech's PowerPlay system here is again an unnecessary inclusion, as it forces Logitech to use a subpar skate design on the mouse's base. And if this system was removed, which it absolutely should have been given the myriad of downsides to it, Logitech could use a much more modern and competitive skate shaping, similar to the ones used by ROG and Razer. And as a last note here, since the skate channel shaping is identical to the GPX2, you can use aftermarket skates from a GPX2 here on the SUPERSTRIKE without issue, which is one positive, as previously Logitech changed the shaping coming from the GPX122, and I'm glad they didn't adjust it again here on the SUPERSTRIKE. So if you want to replace the mouse's frankly atrocious stock skates, any set that was designed for a GPX2 will be compatible here on the SUPERSTRIKE, and 6.5mm dots as I mentioned earlier are also compatible. So if you want to improve the SUPERSTRIKE's overall usage, I'd highly recommend getting a set of aftermarket skates here. Alright, and lastly for cable, disappointing, the SUPERSTRIKE, as we mentioned earlier, is using the same cable type we saw included with the GPX series, which is yet another questionable decision here. Now this cable is a A to C type, but instead of having a paracord wrapping as most cables have, this cable has a rubber wrapping, which is rather sticky and high friction, which causes a lot of drag when moving the cable across a mouse pad. But on the plus side, this cable is rather thin and is decently flexible, but again it lacks a tilted USB-C end, and the wrapping makes the cable less than ideal for wired usage. Now you can use the cable with a bungee, which does make the cable's usage slightly better, but compared to the cables we've seen included with other brands' products, this one is very subpar, and I'm really disappointed Logitech didn't improve the stock cable here on the SUPERSTRIKE, considering the GPX2 came out 3 years ago. But thankfully, since the USB-C port is semi-universally sized, you can use most aftermarket cable types here with the SUPERSTRIKE, so if you want to improve its wired usage you can do so, but seeing as the mouse is capped to 1 GHz on its wired connectivity, you won't likely be using the mouse wired unless you have to use it while charging, that is. But in the future, hopefully we'll see Logitech improve their stock cables as a cable of the same typing, thickness, and flexibility, but with a tilted USB-C end and a low friction paracord wrapping will be a significant improvement over this current stock cable, and hopefully we'll see some improvements to this cable on their future products. Alright, in conclusion, overall, the Logitech PRO X2 SUPERSTRIKE is, in my opinion, the most underwhelming overpriced peripheral release I've covered here on the channel to date. And to be completely honest, I am appalled at how many issues this mouse has, from the mediocre hit system, shoddy QC, the massively outdated internals and specs, a sensor that still has spin-out issues to this day, stock skates that are the worst I've ever seen included on a mouse, as well as a defective scroll wheel encoder, lack of 8K polling, amongst a myriad of other issues, leaves me honestly shocked that Logitech even released this mouse in its current state, as it feels like the most half-assed release I've ever seen. And while the hit system has a lot of potential, it needs way more R&D time, as the current implementation feels more like a paid beta of sorts. And again, the fact you have to set this hit system to its absolute highest sensitivity to get some kind of benefit from it is very disappointing, and as I talked about earlier, the usage experience on the highest sensitivity isn't great, and even in this optimal use case for this hit system, it still delivers worse performance than SPDT switches in essentially every way, especially when it comes to the button's click feel. Now, I'm sure Logitech will improve the hit system in the future, but the current implementation is just mediocre at best. Yes, it is better than most traditional switch types, but again, it's worse than SPDT, and in all honesty, the mouse as a whole just feels like a desperate attempt from Logitech to hold on to what sliver of relevancy they still have in the peripheral market, as more and more brands are surpassing them every day, and the mouse has this weird kind of quirk to it where it's over-engineered in the areas where it doesn't have to be, but under-engineered in the areas where it needed to be, which makes the mouses feel rushed and very half-baked, I guess is the best way I can say it. And to be abundantly clear, I'm well aware that batch 1 Logitechs often have a lot of issues, but even with the QC issues on my unit aside, there are so many beyond questionable design decisions on this mouse, which make the SUPERSTRIKE an extremely hard mouse to recommend, as the overall usage experience and performance offered by other brands' products, specifically ones that use SPDT switches, are superior to the SUPERSTRIKE in its current state. But while the mouse is very underwhelming, I hope Logitech listens to everyone's feedback, specifically the critical ones, and actually updates their product's internals on their next release, as this hit system tech with some more optimizations and R&D time, with an updated sensor, MCU, scroll wheel encoder, and switch, and some other fixes, would be an astronomically better product in my opinion, even if they kept the same GPX shaping, which I don't think they should do, and I would love to see some changes to this. And hopefully we will see Logitech actually improve their future releases as such, and not stubbornly stick to outdated tech as they've been doing so far. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more videos like this, get subscribed so you don't miss future videos, and of course the SUPERSTRIKE's teardown video. And if you want to support my efforts here on the channel with these in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts, and being a channel member gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the Logitech PRO X2 SUPERSTRIKE, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.